Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. Jeb Brugmann has been around for a long time working with cities, with communities, and probably for the last 10 or so years really focused on the resilience piece. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Jeb about the activity that he's doing now with Resilient Cities Catalyst, which he's a principal, and some of the issues that they're tackling, whether it be from a development standpoint or from a neighborhood standpoint. So stay tuned. Hey, Jeb, good to be with you today. How are you?
I'm good. Hi, Leanne. Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, can you just tell the viewers a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I started working in the early 1980s, which unfortunately is dating me, in organizing with local governments throughout the United States to take on global issues. And organized a group of about 600 local elected officials in the US called Local Elected Officials for Social Responsibility. And one of the things that is still well known from that is was co-founder of the Sanctuary Cities movement in the United States. So really developed this whole notion that cities and counties and towns are both on the receiving end of global problems and also can do a lot to address them. So in 1989, I made a connection with the UN Environment Program and convinced them to allow me to organize what at the time we called the International Environmental Agency of Local Governments, and that is now called ICLEI-Local Governments for Sustainability. It's an organization of about 1,200 cities and towns around the world that have been at the forefront for now a good long time. Taking on global environmental issues. So all of the work of cities taking on climate change sort of originated in a Congress that I organized at the UN in 1990. And so that work from the bottom up has been core to my career. Within ICLEI, developed programs working with cities on the full range of sustainability and resilience issues on a global basis. In the last decade, for about 15 years, I started a business consultancy practice with famous business guru, C.K. Prahalad, who wrote a award-winning book called Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. We focused in on designing new products and services. Our clients were mainly global companies that specifically address poverty issues. Worked in India and a number of countries in Africa as well. And then joined the 100 Resilient Cities team, where the focus, of course, has really been understanding what it takes to build holistic resilience in a city. When we think beyond risk management to the capacities in a city to actually continue to achieve its development objectives or their ambitions while they are confronted with a variety of shocks that are unpredictable. So since then, I've been focusing with that team.
So I know a few years ago, but still the content's relevant today. You wrote a book on how cities are changing the world. So just tell me a little bit about that project.
Yeah. So the book is called Welcome to the Urban Revolution, How Cities Are Changing the World. And that was really a reflection on 20 years of my work with cities trying to take on these global issues in a fast-changing global environment. You know, this is all during the period of globalization, of emerging climate change. And what I was addressing, there's the problem of cities being able to be strategic. So in order for a city to really transform itself, we use the word transformation for everything these days. A project can be transformative, which is just actually an oxymoron. A transformation is a fundamental redesign of systems to get different outcomes. But for cities, which I think are properly described as the forum in which 1 million negotiations are taking place every day. That's a city. If you look at, for instance, even the applications for building permits in a city, there's tens of thousands any day where everyone's negotiating out what they want the city to be for them. And there's many ways to understand it. But the book really explored the problematic of how you steer that myriad negotiation over a period of decades it requires to change outcomes in a city, to build a transit system, to fundamentally change health outcomes in a place that has millions of people living in it. What it takes in order to have the capacity for a city to set a target for what it's going to be 10, 20, 30 years and actually achieve it. And there are not many cities that have done that purposefully. So the book really explores what those capacities.
I think as you talk, I'm thinking, boy, I think you and I have somewhat led parallel lives in a way.
Your career in local government has exposed you to all those same things, right? I mean, we've tagged each other in that whole enterprise of trying to both expand the notion of what cities really are supposed to take on and can do in the world, and then to build a capacity for them to actually be that ambitious, whether it's to take on global climate change or address underlying risks that everyone wants to avoid because the election cycle means they can pass it on to the next person or something like that.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So the work you're focused on today and going forward right now, it's really taking all the things you've done, all the things you've learned over the years, and really applying it again, but in a different way. And I know that you're very much a community, belief that resilience starts at the community level. So maybe expand a little on the work you're doing right now, and what advice you would have for other communities in this area.
Yeah. So why does resilience start at the community level? Because, well, it has to be realized at the community level, in that what's different between resilience and risk management is risk management, of course, is the capacity of a city to resist and mitigate the losses and transfer or reduce the losses associated with some shock event. And those are typically systemic. They're not things that a city has any control over, be it a tidal wave or an extreme storm or a global financial crisis or a pandemic. So managing those risks is an essential component to it, but the way those risks play out in a city very much have to do with what the city itself is responsible for, which is what are the chronic stresses in the society in that city, whether it be in the economy or in a neighborhood, that allow a shock to cascade down to damages, impacts, losses of a variety of kind, and sustain those losses over an extended period of time. So resilience is really the ability of the city to be prepared for those shocks. And by the city, I mean not just the local government, but all the other key entities that constitute the economy and the life of the city. And then the ability of the city to reduce those chronic stresses. And when we talk about resilience planning and design, what we're really doing is trying to figure out, what do I need to do in terms of prioritizing and making investments to manage those shock risks? And how do I make those investments in a way that reduce the chronic stresses in the city? Well, where do the chronic stresses show up? They show up most in neighborhoods, and in particular in low-income neighborhoods, and where people have been disenfranchised in some way, or where there's a threat of displacement. And so we see this now with the COVID-19, and particularly in the United States, but it's the same here in Canada as well, where the cascading impact is now on the most vulnerable communities in the country. And sadly for the US and many countries, the same is happening in Brazil, for instance. And we shouldn't be comparing the US and Brazil, but let us. There's more than 100 million people in the United States that live in zip code areas that, according to the Economic Innovation Group, a business group that analyzes vulnerability of this nature, are in highly distressed chronic areas that have not improved their poverty levels, their employment levels, their education levels for decades. And so why I focus in on resilience building at a community level is in those zip code areas where the 100 million people live, out of a population of 350, 360, so huge part of the US economy and society, that ultimately determines how damaged the country will be, how set back it will be, how set back the insurance industry will be, and it goes on and on and on, and its ability to recover. So it's not that all of it happens at the community level. Risk management is still front and center, but ultimately that ability to keep moving forward has to do with those communities being able to see themselves through and not to create the sort of chronic crisis that we saw with the global financial crisis, where it really took a decade. Well, actually, and I'll stop going on about this for a minute, but take a pause. But the distressed communities in the United States have not recovered pre-2008 levels of home ownership and housing stability. So we still have not recovered from 2008 because of those underlying chronic stresses.
Well, and I think a lot of people think, well, you know, it happened, the disaster happened 10 years ago. Why aren't you recovered? It's complicated, and it doesn't happen overnight, and you know that. And the only way I think that the magic is that resiliency piece, because if you're not looking at that, you're just building back the same. You're just doing the same mistakes every time, and it's somewhat insane to me. But you know, I think the discussion is changing. And, you know, it's groups like yours and the work you're doing that's helping to change the narrative. So thank you for doing that. Is there anything before we wrap up that you might, that I didn't ask about that you wanted to say?
Well, you know, I think one of the challenges here, like when we talk about these distressed communities, one of those issues that we face in resilience is every investment you make to improve the conditions in a low income or a distressed community is one that threatens to displace it. Whenever we improve an area of the city, it becomes more aspirational and attractive to those who have income, and that then drives up housing prices or displaces small businesses because franchises now want to come in and serve a new demographic. So one of the real resilience struggles we have is how to do innovation with the property sector. Anyone is interested in the sort of property and business development component of the distressed area, to figure out how those investments are done that continue to stabilize and serve the distressed demographic within that area. Because if they're just being displaced, you're just moving it from one zip code to another zip code, which is part of the shell game the US has played that results in the same level of chronic stress that was there decades ago. So one of the areas I focus in on is how to do planning of resilience in the context of real estate projects that allow a developer, in some cases you can say, it's also referred to in the industry as community benefits agreements. So what is a community benefit agreement? As I build for this new demographic, my normal customer base, I can also design for the extent community and provide them with a number of things that are going to be stress relieving. And I think the best practice in that so far, we're pioneering this work, continuing to do so in Resilient Cities Catalyst, my organization. But the precursor to that is in the US called health and wellness districts, where the chronic stress that a hospital and the medical system broadly was trying to address is extremely awful health outcomes for low-income populations. And these areas were also the cities were seeking to attract investment to revitalize these areas, to upgrade housing and bring small business back in. But what they did is they created these partnerships where all the way down to a case management, household by household case management system, you both built the, if I may, the product, meaning not only middle income and upper income housing, but mixed income housing. You revitalized the main street, not only for chains, but also for the existing, for the small businesses that serve the existing demographic, be it selling them their ethnic food or be it some medical service that they particularly need. And then form a partnership which actually worked with those households to figure out for each one how you stabilize and improve their situation as the whole neighborhood becomes improved. And there's a great case of that in Stamford, Connecticut, called the VITA Health and Wellness District that I'm hoping to now document. It's been almost 10 years, like what the outcomes have been there. This is one of the areas we need to lean in. It's not just like how we help low-income families, you know, do better economically and get their credit ratings back and secure housing, but it's how we work in partnership as a whole development community in order to build places that are great homes for many demographics, including the people who have made that community a real community in the preceding decades, although it's been suffering.
COVID, I think, has forced people to really think about collaboration and the fact that we don't all have independently, we can't achieve as much as we can if we work together resource-wise as well. So, you know, I'm excited to think of more models like what you're talking about in the future, where you've got innovation and you're saying, well, we could do this like this, or we could go outside the box and think about a new way to do it where everybody benefits. And I think that's the key. So,
and it's really a big part of the key is people in the property industry. When we speak of risk, I mean, if you think of a business that has such incredible risk-related challenges, there's so many dimensions of risk in anyone who decides they're going to build a mid-rise townhouse or condo development. I think people who aren't in the industry don't understand just how narrow the scope is for innovation, because everything is so regulated, costs are so out of control. The weather, labor markets, all of these things are so complicated for a property developer. It's something that's unavoidable. So where is the space for a property developer to actually take a risk to do something new is very difficult. So that's where I think we in the nonprofit sector really have to create an environment in which they can learn how to manage a new set of risks that come along with innovating in a product class that will actually deliver this broader set of benefits that can address those underlying chronic stresses.
I think the whole innovation space is the same. It's so regulated to the point where there is no innovation. So, all of these things need to be looked at and go, what's your outcome? What do you really want at the end? Let's figure out the environment in which you can
precisely. Yeah.
grow. So, well, Jeb, thank you very much. I hope to be talking to you in the future as you grow your own organization and perhaps partner on some other things. So thanks for taking the time and wishing you all the best.
Thanks, Leanne. Thanks for having me today.